The city never stopped moving. Cars honked, footsteps echoed, people scrolled through glowing screens, too busy to notice the man sitting quietly on the cold pavement. He was thin, his beard scruffy, his coat ripped at the seams. In front of him lay a piece of cardboard, the words written in shaky letters, "Hungry. Anything helps." In his pocket rested a single crumpled dollar. Wrinkled, faded, torn at the edges. For most, it was nothing, the price of a soda, loose change forgotten in a car cup holder. But for him, it meant survival. It was the difference between another night with an empty stomach or one small piece of bread. That morning, he had already decided he would buy food. Something to calm the gnawing hunger that felt like fire in his stomach. He closed his hand around the dollar, whispering to himself, "At least tonight I won't sleep starving." But then, out of the rushing crowd, his eyes caught sight of a young woman. She walked quickly, her shoulders hunched, carrying two small children who clung tightly to her arms. Their clothes were worn, their faces pale. The little boy's shoes had holes in them, and the little girl carried a doll missing one eye. Her eyes met his, just for a moment. And in that glance, he saw something familiar, the same desperation he had been living with, the same weight of hopelessness pressing her down. He looked again at the dollar in his hand. His stomach twisted. "This is all I have, but maybe they need it more than I do." His hand trembled as he stretched it out. The woman froze, surprised. He pressed the dollar into her palm and whispered, "It's all I have, but maybe it can help you." Her eyes welled with tears. She wanted to refuse, but he insisted. She clutched her children and whispered back, "Thank you, you don't know what this means." He smiled faintly, and in that fragile exchange, something shifted. Stay with me until the very end of this story. Because what looks like the end of hope is often the beginning of a miracle. Not long ago, his life looked nothing like the cold sidewalk where he now sat. He once had a modest apartment with peeling paint on the walls, but it was home. The kitchen smelled of strong coffee in the mornings, and he kept a small plant by the window that leaned toward the sun. He worked in construction, a job that left his hands rough and his back sore, but it gave him pride. At the end of each week, he would sit with his coworkers in a local diner, greasy burgers on the table, laughter echoing late into the night. His wallet never overflowed, but it was enough. Enough to pay the rent. Enough to buy groceries. Enough to live with dignity. But life has a way of changing suddenly. The company he worked for collapsed after a financial crisis. At first, he thought it would be temporary. He told himself, "You'll find another job. You're strong. You've never been afraid of hard work." Weeks passed. Then months. Every interview ended with the same words, "We'll call you." But the call never came. His savings, carefully set aside, shrank with each passing week until his bank account mocked him with zeros. He sold what he could, an old TV, his father's watch, even the furniture he had bought secondhand years before. Each sale felt like erasing a piece of his life. Friends who once called to invite him out grew silent. His phone buzzed less and less until one day it didn't ring at all. The final blow came with a sharp knock on the door, an eviction notice. He stared at the paper, his hands shaking, whispering, "How did it come to this?" He begged for an extension, but the landlord's voice was firm, "I'm sorry. Business is business." Days later, his belongings sat in a heap on the curb. A photograph slipped from a box, him smiling at a barbecue year earlier, holding a plate of food, surrounded by friends. He picked it up, stared at the man in the picture, and whispered through tears, "Who was that man? Where did he go?" From that day forward, the sidewalk became his home. Nights were always the hardest. When the city lights dimmed and shop doors locked, the silence felt heavier than the hunger in his stomach. He curled beneath thin blankets that barely covered his body, the cold concrete seeping into his bones. Sleep never came easy. When it did, it was shallow, haunted by dreams of the life he had lost. Hunger was his constant companion. It gnawed at him, sharp and merciless, making his body weak and his mind foggy. He searched trash bins for scraps, waited in long lines at shelters only to hear, "Sorry, we're out of meals tonight." Shame burned deeper than the hunger. He tried to ask strangers for help, but the words stuck in his throat. And when he managed to whisper, "Please, anything helps," most turned away. Some stared straight ahead as if he didn't exist. Others muttered cruel words, "Get a job. Stop being lazy." Each rejection carved another wound into his spirit. One evening, as rain poured down and his clothes clung to his skin, he found shelter under a bridge. He sat with his knees pulled to his chest, staring at the glow of the city in the distance. He imagined families around tables, warm meals, laughter filling living rooms. The contrast broke him. A voice inside whispered, "You are worthless. Forgotten. Invisible. No one cares if you live or die." He clenched his fists, pressing them against his forehead, and whispered back through tears, "God, if you're real, do you see me? Do you even care?" The silence that followed was crushing. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, a verse from childhood resurfaced, words his mother once read to him before bed, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Psalm 34 verse 18. But as the rain dripped from the bridge and hunger twisted his insides, those words felt like a memory from another life. He didn't know it yet, but the very next day, that single wrinkled dollar in his pocket would test his faith and change the course of his story forever. It happened in a single, ordinary moment, but it would become the defining moment of his life. That morning, he stood near his usual corner, clutching the only thing he had left, one wrinkled dollar bill. He turned it over in his fingers again and again, debating whether to buy bread or coffee. His stomach growled violently, reminding him how badly he needed food. "This is survival," he told himself. "It has to be enough to keep me going." But just as he was about to step toward the bakery, he noticed her. A young mother, walking quickly yet heavily, as if the weight of the world pressed on her shoulders. Two small children clung to her arms. Their clothes were thin against the cold, their shoes scuffed and nearly falling apart. The little boy's cheeks were pale, and the girl hugged a ragged doll with one missing eye. For a brief moment, their eyes met. And in that single glance, he saw his own reflection, the same desperation, the same silent cry for help. Something inside him broke. He looked at the dollar again. It was his lifeline. But compared to what he saw in her eyes, it suddenly felt small. Maybe they need it more than I do, he thought. His hand trembled as he stepped closer. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice rough and uncertain. She turned, startled, pulling her children closer. He opened his hand and placed the dollar into hers. "It's all I have," he said quietly, "but maybe it can help you." The woman's eyes widened. Tears welled up instantly, spilling onto her cheeks. She shook her head, trying to push it back into his hand, but he insisted, closing her fingers around it. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "Thank you, you don't know what this means." He managed a faint smile, even as hunger clawed at his insides. And for the first time in months, he felt something he thought he had lost forever: dignity. He had nothing, yet in that moment, he had given everything. He didn't know it yet, but that single act of sacrifice would send ripples far beyond what he could imagine. The woman held the crumpled dollar in her hand as if it were treasure. To anyone else, it might have seemed insignificant, but to her, it was proof that kindness still existed in a world that often felt cruel. She told her children, "Look, even when people have nothing, they can still give." Later that day, she stopped by a small community center where volunteers served food. She shared the story, her voice trembling. "A homeless man gave me his last dollar. He had nothing, and still, he gave." The volunteers were stunned. They repeated her words to others, and soon the story began to spread beyond the walls of the center. It reached local churches, shopkeepers, and even the neighborhood newspaper. The headline read, "The dollar that changed everything." By the next morning, strangers began showing up at the corner where he usually sat. Some brought sandwiches, others warm coats, and some simply knelt down beside him, shaking his hand and saying, "Thank you. You reminded me that kindness still lives." For the first time in months, he felt seen. People didn't just drop coins into his cup out of guilt, they looked into his eyes, asked his name, and listened to his story. The man who had once felt invisible was now a symbol of courage. And the ripple grew larger. A local charity decided to share his story on social media. Within days, hundreds of people commented, "This inspired me to help someone today. If he can give while having nothing, what excuse do I have?" One small act of sacrifice began multiplying into countless others. Food drives were organized. Donations poured into shelters. Strangers began looking at the homeless in their own neighborhoods with new compassion. Galatians 6 verse 9 came alive. "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." He had not given up. And though he had released the last dollar in his hand, he was about to receive back something far greater than money, the gift of hope returning to his life. It wasn't long before a local nonprofit tracked him down. They had heard the story, the man who gave his last dollar, and they wanted to meet him. When two volunteers approached his corner with warm smiles, he instinctively pulled back. Months of rejection had made him wary. "Are you James?" one of them asked gently. He nodded slowly, unsure if he should even respond. "We just want to talk," they assured him. They invited him to their center, promising nothing more than a hot meal and a safe bed for the night. Skeptical but hungry, he agreed. When he walked through the doors, the smell of soup and fresh bread overwhelmed him. He sat at a table, hands shaking as he lifted a spoon to his lips. For the first time in months, food filled not just his stomach but his soul. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "Thank you, God. I thought you had forgotten me." The volunteers didn't just feed him, they listened. They asked about his life, his work, his dreams. They saw more than a homeless man, they saw potential. Within weeks, he was offered small jobs at the center, sweeping floors, unloading boxes, serving food to others who walked in with the same hollow eyes he once had. He discovered something powerful: giving dignity to others restored dignity to himself. Each time he handed a plate to someone in need, he remembered the day he gave away his dollar. His sacrifice had planted a seed, and now he was watering it with service. Soon, a construction company, moved by his story, offered him steady work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it gave him purpose again. With his first paycheck, he rented a small room, no bigger than a closet, but it was his. He placed the broken photograph of himself at the barbecue on the nightstand and whispered, "Welcome back." He realized then, his worth had never disappeared. It had only been hidden beneath pain, waiting to be uncovered by kindness, both his own and that of others. His last dollar, a crumpled, nearly worthless bill, became the seed of a miracle. What the world saw as poverty, God used as abundance. What looked like the end of hope became the beginning of a new life. James often reflected on that moment. He had nothing left to give, yet he gave everything. And through that single act, doors opened that he could never have forced open on his own. His story reminded people that sometimes the greatest power lies not in what we keep, but in what we choose to let go. Maybe this story speaks to you. Maybe you feel like you have nothing left, no strength, no resources, no answers. You've given, and now you wonder if there's anything left inside of you. But even the smallest act of kindness, even the smallest spark of courage, can carry the power to change everything. Luke 6 verse 38 reminds us, "Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap." James gave his last dollar, and though he thought it would leave him empty, it filled him with more than he could ever imagine: dignity, purpose, and hope. And you, too, can experience this truth. It may not be a dollar. It may be your time, your encouragement, your listening ear, or your forgiveness. What seems small in your hands can be multiplied in the hands of God. If this story touched your heart, I want you to take one simple step: comment Amen below. It's more than a word, it's a declaration that you believe in hope, in sacrifice, and in second chances. Share this video with someone who needs encouragement. Someone who feels invisible. Someone who needs to know that their life can still change. And subscribe to 30 Minutes of Courage for more powerful stories of resilience, sacrifice, and redemption. Remember this: you are never too empty to give, never too broken to be used, and never too far gone to be seen by God. Sometimes, the small